First question is here. Hi, I'm Joanna, a co-founder of a tech startup in Austin, Texas. We're currently in the scaling phase. And it's become clear to me that fostering an ownership mentality amongst our growing team is crucial. From your experience, could you suggest practical strategies that could help us instill this mindset in our employees? How could this affect our productivity and overall success?
This is a huge time for you, Joanna. And first of all, let me just say congratulations for being in a scaling position. I think ownership mentality is a tricky thing to separate from actual ownership. So I don't know what your structure is. I don't know what your thinking is on that, obviously. But in terms of practical strategies, what I would suggest is you actually figure out a way to make your colleagues co-owners, because there is nothing like incentive alignment to get your colleagues to work as hard as they can and as productively as they can.
Yeah, and I think that's a good suggestion for the right kind of business structure, of course, right? And depending on how large, I mean, you said you're starting to scale. One of the things that I teach in my replaceable founder system is these four mindsets that go from cog, engine, engineer, and inventor in that order. And in theory, anybody in any position in the business could have any one of those mindsets. And sort of the really quick version of the way that I try to get people to think about that is, well, actually, I'll give you an example. There was somebody at one of my workshops once who were going around the table asking what they do. And this guy introduces himself and he says, I sell summer dreams. He sells it's a pool maintenance company, right? But he says, we sell summer dreams. And the people that work for him, the maintenance people that work for him, the people that stock the chemicals, all that stuff, they don't believe that they're in the pool maintenance business. They believe that they are in the business of selling summer dreams. That might sound really small, but that kind of change in mentality and having people feel like there's impact in their work and there's an effect to what they do and they matter can also help to foster an ownership mentality.
All right, next question. My name is Ravi, and I run a family-owned grocery store in Boston that's been around for 2 generations. I'm always fascinated by the stories of companies that have stood the test of time. As someone who is keen on carrying on the legacy of our family business, could you share some common characteristics these enduring businesses possess? And Ari, let me just say, as you answer this question, even though Ravi is from Boston, please give Ravi a solid answer if you could.
I will do my best. So first of all, I like that you're thinking about it in terms of the longevity of the business. And the grocery business has notoriously got the most razor thin margins in the world. So it is clearly a place where certain principles and certain ways of doing things can make the difference between a company that lasts and one that doesn't. So there's some very obvious things that we know that several of these businesses share. One of which is that they're always open to innovation, right? So even though we have companies that have been around for hundreds or in some cases over 1,000 years, they're always looking at innovation and they're never getting stuck in their laurels. And as I'm sure you're well aware, especially in the grocery business, there are ways of doing things that have been that way for decades, for as long as there have been grocery stores. Even the way that some shelves are stocked makes no sense in terms of actual business and innovation. I would say that Aldi's actually is an incredible example of this. And we talk about Aldi's in one of our podcast episodes.
We definitely do.
In terms of the way that they innovate. One of the very interesting things that I think about that, and this is not just specific to grocery businesses, although I do want to answer your question, Ravi, is that the typical grocery store, I think, has something like 40,000 SKUs. And in Aldi's, they have about 1,500. So having less is certainly more in a lot of ways in some of these businesses. I think that not just in the grocery business, we see a lot of business try to overcomplicate things and try to get much bigger than they need to. That's one. Another one is that they see themselves, these businesses that last, see themselves as a member of a larger community, almost like citizens in that community and a part of it. And that can mean very different things in different businesses, but that's an important one as well, especially as a family business in an industry that has pretty much been taken over by very, very large retailers, including Amazon. The way to make yourself different and the way to make yourself last is to be different.
Right. But, being a family business, of course, comes with an enormous number of challenges. I have worked one-on-one with some leaders of family businesses, and they do share a unique set of challenges. A couple of things that I would suggest here. Number one, you need to have some principles, right? Because if you don't have a Magna Carta of sorts that you can turn to when time when times get tough, there may very well be the temptation to sell out when, you ultimately are not getting along with other members of your family. So I would urge you to consider that. The other thing is, and Ari mentioned this, the grocery business is a relatively low margin business, or, even razor thin margin business, right? So you have to think about where you can compete and win. And if you're a family business, and as Ari said, you are embedded in the community, I think you should probably think long and hard about how you can differentiate yourself through customer service and excellence. Another family business, or at least a one-time family business in the grocery space, was Piggly Wiggly. And they came up with an incredible innovation that nobody had ever thought of beforehand. It used to be, and you probably know this, you would go to a supermarket and you would ask the grocer to get you all of the items that you wanted, and then the grocer would get on his or her ladder and go get the items and then give it to you. Piggly Wiggly came along and said, you know what? We are going to empower our customer, and consumer products in the store ultimately had to adjust to that new distribution strategy. Now, I'm not saying you should aim to do something as big right away, although it would be certainly wonderful, but you want to be innovative and you want to think about things from the perspective of the customer. And the fact that you are a family business means you don't have to go through committees upon committees to change things. You can be a small, agile, fast-growing business and use your familial structure to your advantage.
That's great. Okay, so hi, I'm Isabella, and I've recently launched a digital marketing firm in San Francisco. Given the speed at which technological changes are taking place and the ever-evolving consumer behaviors, I often find it challenging to balance strategic long-term planning with managing day-to-day operations. Could you please provide some insights on how to strike this balance effectively? Great question.
Great question. I am working with co-founders of a entertainment business now, and they see AI coming directly for them. They know that their business is going to look a lot different in the next year or two. And if they don't make dramatic changes, they're going to be left behind. The problem is the tyranny of the immediate is always sort of weighing upon them heavily, and they just don't ever seem to have time to get to the bigger strategic issues. So what I told them to do was, they're based in Los Angeles. I said, you need to drive out to the desert for a couple of days, particularly in a place where you do not have cell phone service, and you and your co-founder need to work this out. Because if you don't give you and your co-founder the time and space to come up with a new strategy, you will ultimately be eaten up. Your schedule is so important to determining your destiny and where you spend your time. Do not just say, I will get to it another day. You obviously need to take care of business today, but you most definitely need to schedule the time to deal with what's headed at you.
I think that's a really good high-level thinking in terms of how to attack that. Actually, I'm going to give a very, very practical, sort of tactical version. And it goes in terms of the communication cadence that we have with the teams that we work with, and when we talk about what. So basically, we'll have annual goals, quarterly goals, monthly goals. Or the way it usually breaks down is we'll have the annual goals, quarterly focuses, monthly projects, weekly tasks, and then daily tasks are part of those weeklies. And they all relate. And we need to have different meetings about the different ones. So we don't want to be discussing our yearly goals at our weekly huddle, for example. So we want to have sort of like a 3-hour or maybe half-day meeting every year about what the yearly goals are. And then every quarter, maybe it's a 90-minute sort of check-in on what we're going to focus on this quarter. And then those break down into monthly projects, which break down into weeklies. And so we just keep driving, but ultimately everything has a thread back to those larger yearly and potentially 5-year or even 10-year goals.
Love it. Love it. All right. Next question. I'm Thomas, managing a small law firm in New York. Email communication and frequent meetings often seem to take up a lot of our productive time. Oh, Ari's getting ready for this one. Could you suggest some tools or approaches to help us reduce these inefficiencies and make our communication more effective? All right, put your flak jacket on.
Yeah. Okay, so buckle up, everybody. No, yes, actually, law firms are particularly have a big problem with this, particularly because they have to keep track of, for compliance reasons, a lot of times they have to track all the messages that they send and receive.
And to bill.
Yes, right. So The first thing is that there needs to be a communication SOP, like a standard operating protocol for what we use to communicate when. So this might sound obvious, but most companies don't actually have this. In general, companies need to have what I would say is 4 tools for communication. One that is a casual communication tool. Maybe that's something like Voxer or WhatsApp, something that you can use to have casual conversation. We need to have a tool that is for procedural information. So that's like Slack or Teams or Discord even. Then we need to have a third tool that bridges the gap between internal and external. And this one I'll come back to in a second. The fourth tool is a place where things get done. And this is not a communication tool, it's a project management tool. So when we're talking about things that come up for clients or tasks, and there are some really, really great software tools out there, especially for the law industry now, like Clio is a really good one, that is a very sort of forward-thinking, innovative platform for operating a legal business. But we need to, if it's a project or a task or something that's action item, it shouldn't be in a communication sphere. It should move into that project management sphere. But that third one is really interesting. Something that bridges the gap between internal and external. So the problem with email, particularly, and it was mentioned here, is that it is a terrible tool for internal communication. If you just think about the way email is designed, it's a much better transactional communication tool. And internal communication is usually not that. So the businesses that I work with, I teach them not to use email internally at all. So that begs the question, what happens when a client sends us an email and I need to discuss it with another lawyer, another associate? And that's where a tool like Intercom or Front or Drip comes in, because it becomes this shared internal inbox that you can then discuss emails, you can respond, different people can respond without actually creating more internal email. You want to talk about meetings?
I want to talk about meetings. I am a believer, and I tell everybody who I coach this, that you should impose an across-the-board cut on your total amount of meeting time, because the reality is meetings are the ultimate way in which people defer and delay and put off the decision. So first thing, put a cap on your total meeting time. Yeah. And I know that sounds, dramatic and severe, but the reality is meet is murder, or meetings are murder, or if you don't like that metaphor, meetings are Marxism. They are assaults on your time. They prevent productivity. And meetings, unfortunately, far too often become performative displays that are not about getting work done, but about individuals trying to make themselves look good. Second thing, don't have half-hour meetings or hour meetings. Have 20-minute meetings, or if you want, 50-minute meetings, because we all know the first couple of minutes in a meeting are about doing dumb things like talking about the weather and all that kind of stuff. And so a meeting that is scheduled for an hour is often more than an hour. It is an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes, hour and 20 minutes. And then the third thing is you can't just call a general meeting just 'cause, right? That call option that people have on each other's time makes no sense in the modern world. Meetings should have a purpose. You can characterize them any way you want. Sometimes, I recommend using, a decision meeting or a inform and update meeting or a meeting to work out a resolution. Those are some categories you can use, but there are any number of others. I don't care about what categories you use. Just give the other people who are contemplating attending the meeting a sense as to what you're talking about and what the goal is. And if you do that, I guarantee you, your business will not be worse off, and there's a very good chance that you will be better off.
Great. Hello, I'm Sophia, an entrepreneur based in Chicago. I run an e-commerce platform that has been facing considerable shifts in the market due to recent changes in the industry. Could you share some examples of companies that have successfully adapted their business model or practices in the face of significant market changes?
Hi, Sophia. You're a very attractive person.
Thank you. I'm keen to learn more about these companies.
Oh, sorry.
And how they navigate the process.
So this is a long question from Sophia.
People are asking a very good question.
And all right. So Sophia, you're an entrepreneur from Chicago. And everyone who knows me knows that I am obsessed with NVIDIA. NVIDIA, as you may be aware, makes AI computer chips. And they recently joined the $1 trillion club, which means they are one of the most valuable companies ever in the history of corporations. Now, here's the interesting thing about NVIDIA. They didn't start out with a world-dominating strategy or product. They started out very humbly in 1993 when three computer scientists got together at a Denny's and said, you know, it would really be cool if we could make the graphics in computer games a bit more vibrant and responsive and realistic. And so they went off, created a company that ultimately became a very important player in providing the chips necessary to make computer games better and better. And over time, they grew and were very successful, but that wasn't what led them to become the company that they are today. Then the crypto industry hit the world in a big way, and they realized that their computer chips didn't just have applicability in computer games. They saw that there was a hunger and a need for faster processing power to mine Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So they started selling to the cryptocurrency industry. And that worked out great until crypto crashed. And when crypto crashed, everybody thought, uh-oh, NVIDIA is done. But they weren't done, because Jensen Huang, the CEO and founder of NVIDIA, realized a couple of years ago that this AI thing would one day become big. And so even though nobody paid attention to it for a while, he read the tea leaves and made a bet on developing a chip for AI applications. And those AI applications run the gamut from bioengineering to missile systems to any number of aspects in our economy. And of course, when ChatGPT hit, one of the first questions a lot of people asked was, who makes the chips? Who makes the brain power necessary to power that application? And the answer was NVIDIA. And they have been off to the races ever since. So I think the real takeaway here is, even though NVIDIA had a great business in computer games, the reality is they knew that their products could be adjusted and adapted over time to attack even bigger markets. And they were very responsive to that. And now they are, I think, on the way to becoming the most valuable company in the world.
So it's funny because I have these memories of installing my first NVIDIA graphic card into a computer that I built when I was like 14. It's a really fascinating story in the industry. I'm going to give a story about overcoming a challenge that sort of forced a pivot. It's not even a pivot, but just an adaptation in that way to round out the answer here. So you know how they say that New York bagels are the best, or New York pizza is the best. I know you're from Chicago, but
yeah, you may want to stick to bagels.
And a lot of times they say it's because of the water, right? So the second oldest company in the world is a confectionery company in Japan that makes roasted mochi. It was a traditional thing, and started in the 7th century, I believe. And one of the things that was so unique about what they made was that they had this shop in Tokyo, and they were using a stream that was naturally flowing under the store. Health code came along at some point and decided that was not okay. And this was much, much, much later. But that they got shut down essentially for that. This business that had been in business for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I believe, from what I can tell, it's one of the first examples of a company trying to figure out what, not just like, oh, can we find another source and do this, because it just wasn't quite working, but the first time that somebody looked at why is it that the water made it taste this particular way or did this particular thing, and trying to then recreate that. And since then, a lot of people have done that. For example, I believe that Mary Batali has some special process now for making the water that he makes pasta with in America taste like the pasta that's made in Naples because of the mineral content or something like that. So the point there is that sometimes we're going to see challenges like that could very well result in a pivot, but sometimes there might be another way of getting around that barrier.
And now the world's best bagels are made in Japan.
What?
Well,
that's right. Water. I was like, we got to go. All right. Steve.
All right. I'm Steve, and I run a fast-growing software company in New York. I compensate my people well, but I have a hard time in keeping my best employees. I can't determine if the departures are due to the hot job market for tech talent or if there's another factor at play. Do you have any tips on how I can get to the bottom of the problem? Do you have any tips for Steve?
Yes. First of all, and obviously I don't know Steve at all, but fast-growing company is relative speaking, and also saying that you compensate your people well may be very relative, because it may seem well to you, but maybe not to them necessarily, which is sort of an issue in general, I would say, for lots of different companies right now. So one of the things that we're seeing happen, not just it's sort of exploded since the pandemic, but it was starting to happen before that, is what's now being called the overemployed movement, where you have businesses or sorry, individuals that have now been working remote and are working 2 and sometimes 3, and in some very rare cases 4 full-time jobs and getting full-time benefits and salaries from those jobs because they're able to work remotely and they can have a Zoom meeting over here. There's lots of stories of people having 2 Zoom meetings going on at the same time. So one of the things that we have to recognize as a business is that people work in particular ways. Everybody works in a different way. And the idea, and I don't think that this is necessarily a hard sell at this point, but the idea that somebody can sit in a chair for 9 to 5 and be productive is ludicrous. And I know there's a lot of people who still hold a lot of that as an actual idea, but it's just not true. I think the average person is productive for about an hour and a half of those 8 or 9 hours a day. So one of the things that we can do, it's not about money necessarily, but it's about allowing people to work in the way that is best for them. Flexibility, not just working from home. There's a lot of ways that we can support that as well, but asynchronous communication, allowing people to skip those meetings, to not have to deal with those emails, to communicate when and where is best for them. The more that we can do to accommodate a lifestyle that somebody wants to live while still making a living, I think that's one of the things that can make us more competitive, not just the number.
Steve, I think you're the problem. I'm not saying you aren't a great guy. I'm not saying you're not a very successful, hard-driven executive and you treat your people well, at least in terms of compensation. One of the things that I do with every one of my coaching clients is something that I call a worst attribute analysis. What I tell them is, on the first day that I meet with them, I want you to reach out to 10 trusted colleagues and have them give you honest feedback about the worst things they think about you. You need to indemnify them so that they're free to actually speak their mind. And what I have found is that the feedback that comes back is remarkably consistent. You have blind spots like every other executive in the world, and you're the boss. And being the boss is lonely sometimes, and people will not tell you in a normal set of circumstances about what you're doing wrong, because everybody wants to get ahead. Everybody wants to make more money. And so you're in a bubble, and you need to figure out a way to get out of that bubble so you can find out, what people have as an issue with you and why they're looking out the window. There's a Taylor Swift song, Anti-Hero. It's a very honest and raw song where she sings about the fact that the problem is her. Listen to that song, put together your own worst analysis or your own worst attribute analysis, and go out and get out of the bubble and find out what you're doing wrong.
Ritual descent.
Ritual descent. Okay, my name is Kim, and I co-founded a PR firm with my best friend. Aw.
Bad idea,
but nice. We've been in business for about a year, and while the business is growing nicely, I'm feeling guilty about the fact that my partner is responsible for bringing in about 70% of our business. We always agreed to split everything down the middle, but I feel like if we don't figure out a way to split profits according to contribution, it will lead to a bad outcome. Ari and Gregg, any suggestions on how to best handle this problem?
Well, so I think there's already a problem with the question itself, right? Because there's no way that you could each contribute 50-50 on that metric, right? Because presumably one of you is better at sales and better at marketing and bringing in business than the other. Otherwise, you shouldn't be partners, right? You really need to have partners that have complementary skills. And just like Greg and I are not going to always agree on everything, and that's why it's going to make this an interesting conversation. So the fact that she's bringing in 70% of the business, I'm sure you're doing 70% of something else that she's not. So the contributions are not simply based on the revenue that's being brought in. I think that's the big thing. And that's a blind spot I think that everybody has a lot of times. Like, it's just looking at the numbers. But if and of course I'm just guessing here, but if your contribution is setting the business up with compliance measures or good systems or project management or managing a team, then that has to count for something.
And Kim, let me just give you a compliment up front by saying you are clearly thinking about how to address this issue head on before it ultimately blows up in your face and your friend's face. So kudos to you for that. Look, I think that there are a number of creative things that you can do here. Ari makes an excellent point about there are many different ways to contribute to a business, but putting that aside for a minute, There is a difference between ownership in a business and compensation in a business. Now, it's a slippery slope, and it can lead to all sorts of other problems, but you and your partner could agree to each own 50% of the business. And you could devise a formula where if you believe your partner is making a greater overall contribution at the end of the year, your partner, in theory, could keep a greater percent of the profits. Now, it's very hard to measure that. It is something that is very subjective. So I'm not suggesting that you go that way as your sort of first approach. But if you feel like you and your partner need to do something to recognize the fact that she is the big business getter, there are ways to compensate for that without diverging from your core principle of having equal ownership. Because as you well know, there are any number of ways in which PR firms can ultimately monetize their equity. They can be bought, they can raise more money by getting an investment from outside, they can pay themselves out special dividends. There are any number of ways that you both can benefit equally for having the inspiration and the guts to start your own firm, but also recognizing contributions. Just be careful, though. Once you go down the pathway of setting formulas, it's very, very hard to unscramble that egg. And it can get very, very tricky. So proceed with caution.
And also keep in mind that a lot of times there's a difference between the business getter and the business keeper. And both are, depending on the business you're in, one might be more valuable than the other.
True that.
So thanks to everybody. These are great questions and very well articulated as well. So we're going to take more questions from you the next time you have them. And hopefully we'll be able to do these with some people that want to have a little back and forth and do it live. So make sure to tune in more, share your questions, share your thoughts, and we'll give you ours.
Keep them coming. Love the questions. Thank you so much.